You heard the voices of two former presidents mentioning New World Order. And when I hear these quotes in audio clips, and I think to myself how similar they are to statistics and numbers, and how easily manipulated they can be when taken out of context. Quotes, audio clips, stats, numbers, they can all be molded into a certain image that you want to be put out there. Let me back that up with a few numbers. A recent University of Chicago study found that about half of Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory. Nearly 1 in every 5 Americans believe that the U.S. government had some type of hand in 9/11 attacks. 25% believe that the 2008 financial crisis was caused by a small cabal of Wall Street bankers, aka New World Order. Conspiracies and paranoid thinking, once relegated to backrooms and online forums, are becoming a cultural phenomenon throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in America. To help discern between truth and myth, author Aaron John Gulyas takes a seat at the digital mind's eye table. In more recent years, stories like the New World Order, 9/11, mind control, they actually have been bolstered by real revelations of cover-ups by private and public entities. What's real, what's not? Which conspiracies actually hold up to scrutiny? Professor Gulyas and I take a unique view at U.S. history and see where conspiracies fit into it. We're going to take this quick pause, and then we'll be back with Professor Gulyas on the origins of conspiracies. We're back on the Mind's Eye, and I hope you did hear about the recent news about the recent report that found chromium-6, the chemical made famous in the Julia Roberts, Erin Brockovich movie, is still in the U.S. drinking water. Not only is it in this U.S. drinking water, but is found to be at dangerous levels. Why should we be worried about this specific chemical when there's so many different carcinogens already in the water? Well, a 2-year study in 2008 by the National Toxicology Program, which is considered the gold standard of animal testing, found that drinking water with chromium-6 caused cancer in laboratory rats and mice. Is the government and the public entities really trying to poison us? What does Erin Brockovich, the person who blew this case wide open, does she think it's a conspiracy? Not exactly. Erin Brockovich blames it on corruption, complacency, and utter incompetence. If that doesn't sum up the cause of almost every single conspiracy, then hell, I don't know what does. Get all the news you can handle. Check us out at Mind's Eye Show for both Facebook and Twitter. Again, that's at Mind's Eye Show. Or if you don't do the social media thing, you go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. New World Order, secret societies, the Flint, Michigan water poisoning. Are these real conspiracies concocted by a hidden group planning nefarious deeds? Historian and Professor Aaron John Gulyas divulges the origins of your favorite conspiracies after a quick word from our sponsor. Big digital applause for our next guest, author Aaron John Gulyas. It's a pleasure to have you on tonight's episode. Welcome to the Mind's Eye.
Thanks for having me.
We have a bit of a shared background. You're a history instructor, teacher. I'm a former teacher. Tell me if you did happen to notice this yourself, since you are in education. And I don't want to say that there's a perversion of history, but I did notice how history is written by the winners through educational gaps and disinformation, really ultimately blurring the lines between reality and fiction. Am I going a little too far by saying that? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I get this. I get that a lot from students. The idea that history's written by the winner. We're not being told everything. I think it's true, and I agree with some caveats. I think that especially students coming out of the K-12 systems into higher education have had, and I don't want to get in trouble with any of my K-12 high school teachers out there, but they're getting a progressively less useful exposure to history in most places. The thing is, from what I've seen and just from my experience, it's not because there is some sort of cabal out there that's determined to dumb down history education. It's that history, like the rest of the liberal arts in the U.S. education system nowadays, is being pushed to the side, because if you don't know how to become an engineer, how are we going to use you in the future? Is sort of the attitude. So history, literature, things that require critical thinking but don't involve numbers don't get as much attention as they should. And of course there's the traditional gaps in history courses where we sort of follow this path, especially with U.S. history, of constant westward expansion, technological innovation, economic growth, with the assumption that these are all good things, and anything bad that happens to anybody along the way is sort of an aberration as we try to fulfill our destiny. The narrative is basically still like that. So in my classes, what I try to do is tell students there's two things that they need to remember. One, even though history is often written by the winners, that doesn't mean that the losers were quiet, so we should seek out what they've been saying. And also, there could be a discovery that changes a lot of what we think, especially about ancient history, any day now. That doesn't mean that everything you see on Ancient Aliens is true, but it does mean that 100 years ago, when somebody tripped over the corner of what was a building that was part of a city in the ancient Harappan civilization, that everything we know can change once the evidence shows up. I don't think this is a conspiracy to keep things hidden in most cases. I think it's a combination of apathy and ignorance.
No, but can we really trust you, Aaron, is what I want. Because you are, I couldn't help but notice as was preparing for the interview, I did happen to catch a YouTube video that says that you were doing a conference, and your title, I guess I could be wrong on this, was that you are a former member of the Men in Black. So can we really trust you, Aaron?
I always love explaining this to people. It was Paul Kimball, author and filmmaker Paul Kimball, who recorded that segment of my talk about the Men in Black and put it up on YouTube, came up with that title. That I was making is that there was a crop circle near my hometown in Indiana back in 1996 when I was in college, and a friend and I thought we'd have some fun with the locals, and we sort of dressed like we expected government investigators of the weird might dress. I was wearing a tweed jacket and khakis, and he was wearing some sort of trench coat or something, and it was July in Indiana, so we looked like idiots, but and we're sweating profusely, and he had a little device he cobbled together that he said was a paranormal energy detector, and he was walking along the side of the road, looking through it and calling out numbers, and I was repeating the numbers into a tape recorder like we were taking readings or something, and we were acting strangely, and there was one fella in particular, an older guy, who rode up on his ATV, and he claimed that he had been out in the crop circle before anybody was there. When they said they found a cigarette in it on the news, which proves somebody made it, he claimed nobody could have made this. He's got a stack of magazines 5 feet high back at his house. He knows all about it. And then he said, and I know all about you guys too. And we were a little confused. And we said, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, I know why you're here. You're checking all this out. You know all about me. You know all about what's going on. We're like, nope, honestly, we're just messing around. And he wouldn't believe us. He wouldn't believe us. And I sort of imagined that he would later tell his crop circle buddies or whatever that there were these two real weird guys there who were dressed really stupid for July, and they were acting weird but denied they were doing anything weird. And the more I sort of thought about it, the more like, this is a lot like many Man in Black encounters. They're not all sinister and threatening. A lot of times Man in Black encounters are just weird. And for a little 20 years ago, me and my buddy looked like strange people who were pretending to be human because we couldn't quite pull it off convincingly, and we're up to something. And in the talk that's partially up on YouTube, I was sort of expanding on the idea of how many Man in Black encounters that are out there might be explained not with anything paranormal or conspiratorial, but something that's stupid, that gets misinterpreted and blown out of proportion, especially when you look at it through the lens of all of these encounters and all of these theories and all of these other stories that are rolling around in your head as you're trying to process it.
And it sounds like a bad episode of the X-Files, quite frankly. But was that experience part of your... was that a bit of an inspiration to write your new latest book, Conspiracy Theories?
The inspiration for the conspiracy, it was a little bit. Mostly the inspiration for sort of proposing that project to the publisher was that I had written a book about flying saucer contactees, which is what I worked on in graduate school, and I enjoyed doing that. And every semester, what I would run into in the various history courses I teach is a growing number of students who would see something on a website, watch a YouTube video, see something on the History Channel that was connected to some of the major conspiracy theory sort of major conspiracy theory narratives that keep repeating and repeating and repeating in American history and culture. And what I realized was that when a student brings up one of these, I had the sort of, just because of my interests, enough information about them in my head to sort of explain where these ideas came from, what might be accurate, what might be exaggerated or inaccurate, and to talk about those concepts. And then I realized that there's probably a lot of people in introductory history courses, who have students asking the same things, who don't know as much as they should about some of these topics. And so I had the idea of a kind of primer or sort of brief overview of some of the major narrative trends, just to give somebody enough to carry on a decently informed conversation about some of these topics, and hopefully help my fellow educators out of a tight spot when somebody asks about government mind control programs or something.
As any good Men in Black person would do. So,
yes.
So let's get into a little bit more details about the book. It's called Conspiracy Theories: The Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid Political and Cultural Narratives. Now, recent studies supposedly show an increase in Americans' belief in conspiracy theories over the past few decades. Would you consider people of the 20th and 21st centuries more conspiratorial and paranoid than of previous centuries?
Yes, I would. Mostly because there's been a lot more attention paid to the conspiracy theories that have ended up being actual conspiracies. And there's always been individuals within governments, either overtly or covertly, operating and carrying out policies that are not always publicly acknowledged or publicly announced. That's just sort of the way governments have to operate a lot of times, or the way they feel they have to operate. In especially the second half of the 20th century, we've seen more conspiracies, sort of, especially here in the United States. Everything from and things that aren't actually conspiracies, really. We have things like Watergate. We have the deceptions surrounding our involvement in Vietnam. We had things, but things, a U-2 spy plane being shot down, and our initial denials, and then, I guess it's ours. There's a growing sense, and whether it's because of increased media coverage, perhaps, there's a growing sense among Americans, especially starting in the late 60s and up through the present, that it's incredibly possible and even probable that people in power are lying to us. And so when there's a public perception that this is the case, that government is dishonest, not just in the sense of possibly being corrupt, because that's a very old idea, but also in the sense that the government is actively working against the best interests of the nation or against the citizens in some cases. Once that idea takes hold, it's much easier to convince more people these things are going on in other cases, even when they aren't going on. So there were enough real conspiracies, enough real cover-ups, enough real crimes against the people in the Western world in the last 40 years that it's pretty easy to make people believe in ones that might not exist, or to believe in exaggerations of acknowledged cover-ups. So I think increased coverage, decreased trust in political authority has helped contribute to it.
Would you say that there's a psychological makeup or a specific description to what some people would call conspiracists, or is it really a wide demographic, not really specific to any audience particularly?
I know psychologists have done work, and especially anti-conspiracy theory skeptics have done work that sort of come up with these very, very pejorative sort of psychological profiles of a typical conspiracy theorist. They're lonely, they've been betrayed, they have these personality flaws or whatever. I think all it takes for a conspiracy theory to become credible in somebody's mind is, and for the concept of conspiracies and conspiracy theories to take root in someone's mind, is for somebody to be exposed to a conspiracy theory that somehow hits them personally and about a topic with which they're familiar. Sometimes, and some people are psychologically susceptible to these things. There are people who have a great deal of trouble trusting the government, but that's not psychological as much as it is experience in a lot of cases. This county clerk screwed me over on my taxes. Somebody's up to something. I wouldn't be surprised if they're brainwashing little kids to become assassins, because let me tell you about this one time when I was trying to get my license plates removed or renewed. So people's experiences might predispose them to be to be amenable to conspiracy thinking. The types of politics might, or their type of political involvement or political ideology might help this along as well. A lot of times there's a stereotype of the far right being more conspiracy-minded than the far left, but look at a lot of conspiracy theories in American history. There have been conspiracy theories that have appealed to both sides. What I find is that, in general, the further to the extremes your political beliefs are, the more willing you are to believe absolutely horrible things about the other side, right? So if you're a very sort of wing person, the further to the right you are, the easier you find it to believe the most outrageous claims made about people with whom you disagree. Whereas the people who are sort of clustered in the center of the political spectrum sometimes don't have that level of willingness or readiness to believe. So I'm not sure it's a psychological thing. I think it had individual experiences, and also how deeply invested in your own political worldview you are and what threats you see against that.
Like everything else, people bring their own biases to it. People are going to select, edit, and omit as needed to fit within whatever agenda or topic, I guess, they're trying to investigate.
Absolutely.
Would you say that there are positive effects that conspiratorial thinking can have on a society?
That's always a scary sort of road to start going down, right? It's like, well, you know what America really needs is more paranoia. But I think in some cases it's everything in moderation, right? Mm-hmm. If you see conspiracy everywhere, if you cannot read a story in the newspaper without assuming that they are lies, and additionally that those lies are being fed to said newspaper by an international globalist cabal bent on destroying national sovereignty and putting you in some sort of camp, then that's not healthy for anybody. But if you've been doing some reading and you've been reading books, and especially less well-known books about American history, and you start to see that, yeah, there have been many times that governments at the state, federal, and local level have engaged in cover-up, it might make you a little more skeptical about the claims of people in authority. And that, I think a healthy skepticism about people who are in charge is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it doesn't move to an incredible extreme. I'm seeing some of that kind of unsurprisingly here in Flint, Michigan, where I teach. You and listeners have probably heard about the disaster with the water lines here in Flint.
Yes, of course.
The lead water, or the mismanagement of the water supply to the point where children have been poisoned. So there's a healthy skepticism about this that is the result of actual personal experience with actual documented mismanagement. That's a healthy skepticism of a government that has earned some extra scrutiny. On the other hand, you can take that to some unhealthy extremes, to the point where not only am I very, very mistrustful of what the officials might be saying about the water supply or about whatever other topic that you're involved with, you go from that to, well, they are actively lying to us in order to carry out some agenda that is not supported by any evidence. And I think that's the sort of line between, well, what's a healthy, I want to say devotion to conspiracy theories, or a healthy acceptance of conspiratorial thinking, and an unhealthy one, when you start to outpace where the evidence actually takes you, and you start relying on, well, of course everybody knows that blah blah blah, or it just makes sense that blah blah blah. Once you get outside that realm of evidence, then you're in the world of conjecture, and that's when, honestly, that's when the really fun conspiracy theories sort of just get started, when we leave the evidence behind and we're going on the claims of sort of lone wolf whistleblowers and things like that. So there is healthy conspiracy thinking, but you could also call healthy conspiracy thinking sort of just your basic rational skepticism.
Logical fallacies seems to be a running line, slippery slopes, the further fallacy, taking things not necessarily where they need to be or taking to that next step. Let's go into that a little bit more, and let's talk into details about your book. So there's 6 parts to the book: secret societies, new world orders, aliens, mind control, mad science, and forbidden knowledge, and last but not least, the hidden world of Nazi. And it seems to me you picked the most current conspiracies, or at least maybe the most pervasive in society right now. There must have been some overlapping, because depending on who you're talking to, they're all mixed up in one.
Yep. That was, once I sort of sold the publisher on the concept, I realized that this was going to be a nightmare to structure because, I wanted this sort of, we're breaking it down into the common sort of themes, but those all get mixed up with each other. For example, at every point in every one of these sort of broad conspiracy categories, you're going to have some kind of secret society Freemasonic conspiracy theory show up in everything from mind control to alien invasions. You are going to have Nazis show up just about everywhere. No matter what you're doing, there will be Nazis. You're going to have the idea of globalism and the idea of a global plot to enslave mankind. That's going to show up in all of these as well. So I tried to go with things that people would encounter in their, I want to say daily life, but in their, well, actually, yeah, if you're on Facebook, you're going to encounter these conspiracy theories in the strange posts that your friends put up on their walls thinking they're true. You're going to have your uncle put up something about how the UN is going to take away our right to grow radishes or something like that. This is to happen. But you're right, there's a lot of overlap between those categories. And I tried to, in sort of each chapter as I go, sort of highlight the connections between that chapter's conspiracies and the ones that had come before, and areas of blending, sort of those conspiracy Venn diagrams that show up.
And that's what makes it difficult to even try and find either the origin or whether these have any basis in truth, because it's shrouded in mystery and there's a blending, and it's hard to be able to decipher what's real, what's connected, and what's not even connected, and if any of that is really valid at all.
That's absolutely right. And the way I went about it was to try to go back to what I could find as historical fact that was about as incontrovertible as I could. For example, with secret societies, there were in Enlightenment, sort of 18th century era Europe, a number of secret societies that were, in general, opposed to the power that the Catholic Church and in some cases the Protestant churches held within the governments of European countries, that were opposed to restrictions on free speech and free thought, and which had to meet in secret because getting together and complaining about the king and the church was illegal. Were they secret societies because they were planning to topple all the kings of Europe and establish a satanic atheist, if those can be the same thing, satanic atheist, new world order in Europe? Probably not. They were secret because you didn't want idiots showing up, and you didn't want the cops showing up. So you keep these things secret. So we know that yes, there were secret societies in Europe. And so how do theories about secret societies go from the largely non-contested historical facts? How do they go down the path to, I think about that, the extreme I ended up on was the various stories from David Icke and people like David Icke about, this isn't just about the Freemasons, this is about reptilians from the lower fourth dimension who have penetrated our reality and have disguised themselves as world leaders who are connected to the ancient Babylonians. He there's a sort of thread of narrative as you start with the secret societies and you add layer upon layer upon layer of conjecture and irrational dot connecting and all of these things, and also believing everything anybody's ever said to you about anything, and pretty soon you're David Icke. So yeah, you sort of started off with where you can get to the documented historical truth, and then you sort of follow these stories as they develop, and as they get repeated over time. Every generation discovers these conspiracy theories for the first time and think they're onto something.
It's like a telephone game of sorts.
Absolutely. I heard about this. Oh my gosh, you know what? I think I heard something about that too. Well, if you heard about it and I heard about it, and the things we heard largely agree with each other, well, that's pretty much proof right there. So, yeah, two people knowing the same thing is not the same as something being real. And problem is, debunking is necessary sometimes, but debunking is not as fun as lizard people from the fortune disguising themselves as Queen Elizabeth. I mean, honestly, nothing's as fun as that. But it's not a useful way to think about how the world works, though.
Well, truth is definitely stranger than fiction sometimes. But wouldn't
Yes.
the Illuminati be a great example of that? That was a legitimate secret society, really grown out of the Enlightenment age, and then now it's been a bit perverted in what I guess has happened since then and what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. The Bavarian Illuminati, when they started as a secret society in 1776, really their ideas, their thoughts, their notions about changes and reforms they would make to government and society weren't really that different from what Enlightenment philosophers in Britain and the British colonies in America and France were saying. The thing is, Germany, or the German states at the time, the ideas they were having, the things they were talking about, and some of the books they were reading from other parts of Europe, like Britain, weren't legal in a lot of cases. So this was a society that was intellectually very much in line with the rest of the Enlightenment. They just, because of circumstance, outed much more sneakily and with a really cool name. And if you think about it, I mean, Illuminati sort of, I mean, the term Illuminati now is so freighted with conspiracy overtones that it's easy to forget that illumined and enlightened are basically synonyms. But we don't talk about the Enlightenment conspiracy. We talk about the Illuminati conspiracy because that's the group that the stories get told about. And so things snowball from there, and pretty soon we see things about the Illuminati today is doing this, and that. And, most conspiracy theorists in their writings about this say it can be traced back to 1776 in the Bavarian Illuminati, but they don't really do that tracing a lot of times. They point to some organizations here and there that might connect them, and then they sort of hop off trying to solidify those connections that they've claimed, and they jump into, by the way, did you know that Illuminati is from the same root that Lucifer comes from? And then they go off into that, and pretty soon you're down the rabbit hole, and the poor Bavarian Illuminati and their role within the context of Enlightenment Europe gets left behind, and you're busy chasing reptilians around Windsor Palace.
I think people document saying that the Illuminati started May 1st, 1776, just a couple months before the start of, I guess what we can call the official start of America in, documentation-wise in a sense. And so it's easy to, I guess, make that leap or to not really even have the details. And that kind of leads us to one of the, I guess, the Masonic theory in America. That's one of the oldest ones in America.
Yep. And there is absolutely no denying that a high proportion of prominent early Americans, including many of the founders like George Washington and others, were Freemasons. That is absolutely true. Does that mean that the United States itself is of a vast Freemasonic project to, I'm not sure what they want to do, but to control America? Has America always been controlled by Freemasons? Maybe. A lot of people in powerful political positions are part of some kind of law Freemasons or other organizations like that. And at some point you see that this becomes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The early founders were Masons. Prominent early Masons were Masons. Masonic lodges were well established in the major cities in America. So if somebody wanted to get into politics, if somebody wanted to have a position in the government or in business, what's the first thing you would do?
Of course,
join the Masonic lodge. And so, not because it was trying to take over everything, but because this is where you made the connections. And similar to today, do you know how many people working in the State Department are members of the Council on Foreign Relations? Well, probably a lot of them have some connection to the Council on Foreign Relations, because that's a place where a lot of high-powered people who talk about foreign policy tend to hang out. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't people within these organizations that are that are up to no good. There are always people who are up to no good. But sometimes we see the conclusion being made that organizations like the Freemasons, like the Council on Foreign Relations, like the Royal Commission, that their entire purpose for existing is to undermine whatever it is you in particular hold dear. And that differs from theorist to theorist, because like you said earlier, we all bring our own biases to these things. But yeah, early American, the fear and panic about Masonic control of the government was so profound in the early 1800s, early to mid 1800s, that an entire political party, the Anti-Masonic Party, was formed to keep Freemasons out of political office, because it was felt that it was a form of corruption, that they did not have the best interests of the people in mind. And really the only thing that derailed that was, concerns about new problems, particularly slavery and the Civil War. As we get into the 1840s and 1850s, all of the usual conflicts that we think about in that time period sort of eclipse fear of Masons and things like that. But all the way back to the early 19th century, there's been these conspiracy theories about Freemasons and American government have been circulating.
Americans have always been conspiracists. What can we say? We love it. Let's take a quick break, and we're going to pick it up from that point, and we'll bring it to the present time in the last 50 years or so. We'll be back with author Aaron John Gulyas right after this quick word from our sponsors. We're back with author Aaron John Gulyas, and we're talking about his book, Conspiracy Theories, the Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid Political and Cultural Narratives. Now, I have something that I have been hiding from you, Aaron, and I hope you don't hate me because of this. I am a Freemason. I won't lie to you. I'm going to put all my cards on the table.
I'm fine with that.
Okay. Now, I am not trying to take over the world. From my understanding, no other lodges or brothers that I'm aware of are trying to take over the world. And the truth is, we probably don't really do ourselves many favors. I mean, that is the very nature of a secret society, not telling, not revealing, having symbols and rites that are mysterious to people who aren't part of it. So, I mean, clearly, Masons aren't really doing ourselves any favors.
Especially in early America, when there's this sense of, especially once we get into the 1820s and the 1830s, and this sort of Jacksonian democracy sense of equality and leveling of status, that in America, where everybody can start off and at any point and do whatever they want to with their lives, there's this tiny cabal of people who are doing God knows what, and this isn't right. This is a problem. This is scary. So yeah, I mean, it's if you act shifty, people might think you're shifty. But on the other hand, if you're acting shifty, maybe it's just fun. I mean, I went and pretended to be a crop circle investigator. I have no moral high ground here, as far as behaving in a way that might make people suspicious.
All right, well, I'm glad we're on the same level here then. To give out your website before we continue about your book.
Yeah, my website is ajgulyas.com, ajgulas.com, and on Facebook, if you search for Aaron John Gulyas, my author page will pop up, and I put things there occasionally. Not as often as I should, but, having an actual job tends to, if I'm not actually writing a book, I tend to be busy not writing a book, so, and when I'm on Facebook posting things about things I'm working on, it's because I'm procrastinating working on those things. So, not updated as frequently as I might like, but all kinds of stuff to look at there.
How dare you want to live a life?
I know.
And I really couldn't recommend it. I was going through it. There's a lot of really interesting articles that you have links to, some really great opinions. I couldn't recommend it. And obviously we have those links up on our website now. Let's continue about the book, Conspiracy Theories, The Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid Political and Cultural Narratives. One of the biggest conspiracies that's pervasive throughout the whole 20th century and continuing right now is the New World Order. And that's obviously which we've explored, but it's really that a secretive power elite with a globalist agenda is conspiring to rule the world through authoritarian world government to replace, America's sovereign nation states. Could you say that there is some element in truth in the fact that media, food, major industries are continuously being consolidated? 6 corporations control 90% of the media in America. Go to any supermarket, 10 companies pretty much own everything that's in your supermarket. I mean, so there is some element of in truth that few people do have control of most of the finances and news.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great sort of segue, because I get to sort of drop my sort of advice to people who think about conspiracy theories. The things that the conspiracy industry is telling you to be paranoid about are probably not the things to be paranoid about. I find it much more concerning, like you said, that 6 corporations control the vast majority of the media in this country, and that and that there are agribusiness corporations that have patented the food we eat. Seeds of the food we eat. I find that incredibly troubling. I find it way more troubling than the idea that the United Nations, which rarely, if ever, does anything actually useful, well and efficiently, is plotting to take everybody's guns and put us into concentration camps. But if you look at conspiracy websites, conspiracy email lists, boy, that's how old I am. Email lists. If you look at these email lists people are on, if you look at conspiracy theory forums, if you look at the comments threads on YouTube videos, which nobody should ever do, it's a horrible place full of horrible people. What you find is not as much. I'm very concerned with the consolidation of media corporations. What you see is, what really bothers me? It's the globalists. And how you define the globalists probably depends, going back to the idea of bias again, probably goes back to what your particular fears and biases about globalism are. Are you worried about a loss of national sovereignty? Then you are way more concerned about the United Nations. Are you concerned about the rising of a corporate oligarchy? Then you're probably more concerned about Archer Daniels Midland and News Corp and Rupert Murdoch. So depending on where your fears about globalism are focused, you're looking at different things as far as entities seeking to subjugate us all. But by far, in the sort of, especially the wacky conspiracy realm, it's this New World Order, United Nations, elimination of national sovereignty fear that's become incredibly prominent since the end of the Cold War, basically, especially when President George H.W. Bush actually used the phrase New World Order and sent typewriters a-fluttering across North America. If you go back and read bits of the internet that were first put up back in the 90s, you will see this fear develop and then kick into high gear once Bill Clinton's elected. This fear, especially political right in the United States, that our days as a country are numbered because of the United Nations and the allies of the United Nations and traitorous politicians within our midst who are going to allow a United Nations military force to come in and take over the country. And everything, nearly every political event, economic event that occurred in the 1990s could be twisted and turned to fit into that grand narrative. When David Koresh's Branch Davidian compound in Waco burned down after the standoff with BATF agents. It's clearly a plot to sensitize Americans to their places of worship being torched by the government. There were all kinds of stories about. There's one guy in particular who says he knows for a fact that the people who burned down the Branch Davidian compound were foreign troops from Eastern Europe, because no American would ever obey those orders. So, it's all starting. You have little things like up here in Michigan back in the 90s, the state government was, as they were in many states, putting stickers on the backs of road signs that did things like tell you when the road sign had been put up, and weird little Department of Transportation code numbers and things. A guy up in northern Michigan thought he figured out that this was an actual system, that where the stickers were placed on the sign on the back were going to be clues for an invasion force that didn't speak English and couldn't understand road signs or maps, so they would be able to get good patriotic Americans to the FEMA New World Order death camps. So if they would drive on the wrong side of the road, that was what they were taught to do, and they would look at the stickers on the backs of the signs and deduce where they were supposed to take people. Now I look around and there's not nearly as many stickers as there used to be. So clearly they realized that they've been caught and they have a new system to guide the invading troops to the death camps.
I love my conspiracy theories, but even that one's a little bit out there for me.
That one is hilarious. I first heard about it when I was in college. My roommate's hometown in Muncie, Indiana, had a public access station. The local right-wing militia group had an episode of their public access show where they explained all about the road sign stickers. So that was my first exposure to this back in 1994 or so. So it's a strange, convoluted theory. You would think that if they were going to go to the trouble of bringing in an invading foreign army of globalist troops to round up everybody, that they would have some system better, random stickers on the back. Well, not random, but stickers on the backs of road signs. But it's a conspiracy theory that you can go find out for yourself, because as soon as you find a road sign with a sticker, it's proven that it's true.
It's that simple to take that leap, and it's hard not to take the leap, because I mean, you mentioned how George Bush mentioned the word New World Order. I mean, sometimes, like I said, how Freemasons don't do themselves some favors, politicians and presidents don't do themselves. Woodrow Wilson, Winston Churchill, Henry Kissinger, they've all used the term New World Order sometimes, and these clips are taken out of context many times. But I mean, you would think by now, hey, let's not use that term New World Order.
Yeah, and the fact that Bush only really used it that once is explained away by some conspiracy theorists as the leaders of the globalists got really mad at Bush for revealing their secret phrase before the time was right. So he was they said, okay, don't use that phrase anymore because they're going to be on to us. So the conspiracy theorists sort of develop into almost meta conspiracy theories about conspiracy theories, and it gets even more convoluted. But yeah, and here's the thing where we see the intersection of actual reality with some of the more extreme conspiracy theories. There are people in positions of political and economic power who are absolutely globalists. There are those who have argued for the UN to undertake population control programs in order to conserve the Earth's resources. What the conspiracies do is they make a massive leap between one person or a small group of people making a statement about what they think, and because they may be connected to the UN in some way, they declare that it is UN policy that we are going to reduce the human population to 500 million people by the year 2027, or something along those lines. So it's not that everything in conspiracy theories is made up. A lot of it is right out there in the public domain to notice. It's the conclusions you draw based on the information you find that lead people down paths that aren't supported by the evidence, and in some cases lead to actual full-blown paranoia. Some things.
And when you were describing the theory before that, you and I were a bit laughing at, and of course, conspiracists have this negative connotation. I mean, even me, who's someone who seriously, objectively looks at it, and someone like you as well, who's doing the same. I mean, I can't help but have that image of a person in a tinfoil hat, paranoid, and even I know that's a major issue because there are founded and real conspiracies, and we do know that the government did at one point after as a response to the groundswell of public criticism on the Warren Commission with JFK assassination. I mean, they told to start using the word conspiracy theory, the term conspiracy theory, as a way against to kind of turn it up its head and have a negative connotation over. So we know that that conspiracy theory is something that government takes legitimately. and two, they're trying to make it seem not real in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds, this sounds kind of dismissive, but a stopped clock is right twice a day, right?
Right.
Back when we had clocks, everybody, stopped clock, they would occasionally stop, and every 12 hours, it would be the right time. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that you aren't right sometimes, and with the Warren Commission, that origin of the term conspiracy theorist, one of the things about the Warren Commission that isn't as well known as others is that the Warren Commission was only one of two major government investigations into the Kennedy assassination. There was another one later that
the House Select Committee.
Exactly, that didn't the Warren Commission in some pretty significant ways. So to pretend that the Warren Commission has always been the be-all and end-all of the JFK assassination is just ignoring the actual things the government publicly did, which is where all the really juicy conspiracy stuff is. A lot of it's hidden in plain sight. MK Ultra, the government the sort of umbrella for the government mind control programs in the 1940s and 50s and into the 1960s is a great example. In the 1970s, papers get declassified as part of a number of Senate investigations, the Church Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, and all of these things, into misbehavior by the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the things that comes out is that using, in some cases, hypnosis, in many cases, drugs and electromagnetic stimulation, the CIA was attempting to figure out ways to mess with people's minds, to turn them into assassins, in a lot of times this was focused on enhanced interrogation techniques. We don't have to waterboard people if we can inject the right chemical into them, or zap them with the right frequency of ultrasonic sound or something like that. So there were absolutely attempts to undertake mind control, and it wasn't just the government. It was universities in the United States and Canada that were getting government contracts to carry out these psychological experiments. These are absolutely documented things. But then you talk about organizations not doing themselves any favor. The CIA director, Richard Helms, ordered a bunch of documentation destroyed, much of it having to do with these mind control programs. And so now, when somebody like Kathy O'Brien, who claims to be a victim of the Monarch mind control program, under which her psyche was fractured and she was used as a secret courier and sex slave for every president from Reagan through Clinton. I think it was Reagan through Clinton, and also for Gerald Ford when he was a congressman. She can say, well, I was in the Monarch program, and you can say, well, I've looked through the MK Ultra documentation. There is no Monarch program. All you have to say is that program was part of the documentation that was destroyed by the CIA because they didn't want you to know about it. The CIA sort of created this loophole for anybody to make almost whatever claims they want, and all they have to say is, with a lot of credibility, is, well, this is the really bad program, which is why they destroyed those records and let these other records be released to the public. So they're giving themselves, they're not putting themselves in a great position. Again, if the object is to deny that the CIA is involved in child trafficking and sex slavery. If you're at all familiar with Kathy O'Brien, she was originally from Michigan, out near Muskegon, and in her book, Transformation of America, spelled like the word trans-formation of America, she talks about a childhood that is just some very graphic sexual abuse. Talks about child pornography rings with, she names some prominent state politicians who were involved. She claims her parents and family members knew about this. And I was doing some internet searching just to sort of see if the names she named as far as her family members were real. And I found, this is horrible, I found her father's obituary. And in the guest book section on this funeral home website, there's a bunch of people talking about how he's a child molesting monster, you need to read Kathy O'Brien's book about her mind control experiences. First times I've seen that, a conspiracy theory topic that I was familiar with in the abstract from reading books and watching films and interviews of this person, to a very personal level of people insulting her dead father on a funeral home website. Things spiral out of control.
Yeah, it's that easy, unfortunately, and I can't really comment on hers, but I mean, we do know that those type of pedophilia rings do happen, but obviously that's not what we're going to focus on. Speaking with the keeping on the mind control part of it, I mean, there is that theory that, and this is something that I've explored myself, that Sirhan was, a Manchurian candidate, someone who was under mind control, who killed Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, what are your thoughts on that matter?
I think it's interesting because, again, we know the CIA was working on these mind control projects. We know that Sirhan, I mean, there's no question that he shot Kennedy, but it's always been very fuzzy as to why he did. Stories change over the years. It's a very strange thing. So when you have an assassin who doesn't necessarily act like a typical assassin, combined with just a few years later, news of the mind control experimentation reaching the public, if it's not a logical conclusion to draw, it's not an outrageous conclusion to draw that this might be the case, especially in the absence of better explanations. I can't say for sure whether he was a Manchurian candidate. I haven't actually looked at that case, the situation well enough to actually cast my ballot in one direction or another. But if we're sort of grading conspiracy theories on how plausible they are, that one is way more plausible than a lot of them, right? So absolutely not something that you have to be crazy to think about, which is a pretty good way to think about conspiracy theories. Am I wasting my time even thinking about this, or is this something that at some point in 5 years, somebody's going to uncover something that actually proves, one way or the other, what might have happened?
Let's say in 5 years, 10 years, what conspiracy that's occurring now, or maybe a newer one, or something that's been around for a while now, which one could turn out to be real?
The one that I think is that I would not be surprised if we get some sort of verification of is the idea that everything we've been told about the U.S. space program is not everything that exists about the U.S. space program. Not necessarily. I mean, I do not think that we faked the moon landing or anything like that, but I've heard some people discuss, and I've read some discussion, and it makes sense to me that the moon landing that was televised in July of 1969 might not have been the first time we've been to the moon, and there's no actual proof, but there's sort of a logical reasoning side of it, which is if we are televising our attempt to land on the moon, we really be sure that we can actually do it without killing everybody. So were there dry runs of moon landings before the one that's brought out with the big fanfare for public consumption? It wouldn't surprise me if we find documentation, or we start to hear about manned space missions that were perhaps more advanced than we were told we had the capabilities for at the time. I'm not talking about Roswell technology or anything like that, but just we actually, we tried out the lunar lander on the moon before we told everybody we tried out the lunar lander on the moon. It wouldn't surprise me if something like that gets revealed. It wouldn't surprise me if we get some final conclusive proof and documentation about the arms for hostages, the 1980 October surprise that's been floating around conspiracy culture and the more mainstream conspiracy culture since the late 1980s, that the Reagan campaign actually did a deal with the Iranian government to keep the American hostages in custody until after Reagan beat Carter in 1980. It wouldn't surprise me if there's more documentation about that might show up at some point.
Interesting. And actually interesting, particularly on the NASA one and the dry runs. I actually never heard that angle before. To me, that actually sounds fairly plausible. What about 9/11? I mean, there seems to be some something unfolding recently, particularly with the Saudis. I mean, that was
Yeah.
part, the truther movement. You can just, there's a lot of different parts to it, but one angle was that the Saudis were behind it, and that the Bushes did help cover that up. And now we're seeing with recent documents being released that is pretty much true.
Yeah, I forget the exact number, but the missing so many pages from the 9/11 report that were only recently released. There does seem to be much more of a connection to Saudi Arabia than was acknowledged at first. And the 9/11 truth movement is really interesting because, like a lot of it's grown up very quickly. I mean, because you had to start with the event happening, right? So in 15 years, we've gone from 9/11 not being a thing because it hadn't happened to a massive wing of the conspiracy world is focused on that in some way. And what's interesting about the 9/11 truth movement is the way that other conspiracy realms have sort of absorbed it or made use of it. The New World Order people have used it. The corporate conspiracy folks have used it. The alien disclosure exopolitics people have used it, saying that 9/11 was staged and carried out by with a scalar ray weapon, scalar beam weapon, I think is the phrase, from the moon or from orbit that was made with alien technology. So everybody sort of hops on board with this new conspiracy, and it's amazing how in just 15 years there's an entire 9/11 conspiracy culture that's in a lot of ways distinct from the rest of conspiracy culture. I meet students who are who have been very sort of deeply into the 9/11 conspiracies, who don't know about the Illuminati or all of the other sort of standard conspiracy theories. This is sort of it's a new generation coming up, and 9/11 is their conspiracy theory in a lot of ways. And radical claims about particle beam weapons from orbit tend to obscure what might be much more substantive cover-ups about the role of nations, perhaps say Saudi Arabia, in the whole thing as well. So once again, there are in a lot of ways the outrageous conspiracies serve distraction, I think, sometimes to keep people away from what the real cover-up might be. Sometimes I wonder if there isn't more organized disinformation in the conspiracy theory realm than we might like to admit. Sometimes I wonder to what degree conspiracy theorists might be manipulated by mysterious dark powers who want things covered up.
Don't worry, you don't have to say it. I'll say it. That is what's happening. But I know I only have you for a few more minutes, so I guess we got to wrap it up. And really, the truth is, we barely scratched the surface of your book. And I apologize for this ahead, because I know I honestly I just tried focusing on the ones that. What can we prove? What are the ones with evidence? I know you also talk about aliens and the Nazis' underground bases, but that's just, and I believe, for me, aliens, so I'll put it out there, I think it's just a mathematical probability that they're out there. Otherwise it doesn't really make any sense that we're the only ones out here. But I just didn't want to focus on that because we really couldn't prove any of that. We can't, or disprove it either way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a huge, I mean, if we talk about the chasm between there was an organization called the Bavarian Illuminati to the New World Order, that's one massive chasm and logical leap. If we're talking, there is a mathematical probability that life exists somewhere else in the universe, and they're coming here in flying machines, and the government shot down a flying machine, and they have the flying machine, and that's how we got fiber optic cable. That's just dumb. So,
it's a slippery slope. It's a logical fallacy.
It's if A then B, if B then C, right? So just we go from baby steps to we have slid to the bottom of the mountain on our slippery slope. One of the things that does interest me about the most about the alien conspiracies is the way that it glommed onto the political conspiracy theories in the 1990s. It's not just the aliens being covered up. It's the aliens and their plot to destroy the United States and bring us into a one world order. So you have the New World Order guys sort of hanging out with the alien guys, and some cross-fertilization of ideas happening there. But yeah, just as it stands, the alien stuff is way more interesting thought experiment and less where's the historical truth in this particular theory.
Conspiracy theorists make strange bedfellows sometimes. You never
Yes,
know
they
who
do.
you wrap up in.
Whatever will sell out tickets to your conference.
Well, I hope to see you at one of those conferences you're getting paid to. But when we walk away from, when the reader walks away from the book, again, the book's called Conspiracy Theories: The Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid, Political, and Cultural Narratives. By the time they close the book, what do you want them to walk away to walk away with? What lessons should they come away with?
I want them to come away thinking that that not all conspiracy theories are true, but not all conspiracy theories are false. That just blindly dismiss anything that sounds conspiratorial because it sounds conspiratorial, because sometimes there is a conspiracy. And when we get distracted by the outrageous, we sometimes fail to notice the very real things that might be impinging on our rights and our freedoms and our liberties, because we're being distracted by claims that are unsupportable. The smaller scale, quieter, more rational, less exciting claims of danger in our midst are being ignored because it doesn't. You can't make a TV series out of, there's a lot of interesting information being done about, how these two people were connected to this person over here, and, then somebody should have gone to prison but didn't, and money's lost or rights are violated, or all of our newspapers are owned by a guy in a van somewhere, and horrible things happen, and we weren't, the people who were paranoid enough to pay attention were too busy being paranoid about the particle beam weapon on the moon. Sometimes
it's hard to see the forest through the trees.
Yes.
And give out your website and where people and where our listeners can grab the book.
Yeah, the book's available on Amazon. That's the best place to get it. The Kindle version is relatively affordable for a book from an academic publisher. On the web, I'm at ajgulyas.com. That's AJGULYAS, and there are links for my other books on and a link to my Facebook thing and everything like that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, author Aaron John Gulyas with his book Conspiracy Theories: The Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid, Political, and Cultural Narratives. I really appreciate giving us a moment of your time.
Thanks for having me on. Enjoyed it.